Stop doing the things that you know are wrong that you could stop doing. Right? So it's a fairly limited attempt. First of all, we're not going to say that you know what the good is or what the truth is in any ultimate sense. But we will presume that there are things that you're doing that for one reason or another you know are not in your best interests. There's something about them that you just know you should stop. They're kind of self-evident to you. Other things you're going to be doubtful about. You're not going to know which way is up and which way is down. But there are things that you're doing that you know you shouldn't do. Now, some of those you won't stop doing for whatever reason. You don't have the discipline, or maybe there's a secondary payoff, or you don't believe it's necessary, or it's too much of a sacrifice, or you're angry or resentful or afraid. Who knows? So forget about those for now. But there's another subset that you could stop doing. It might be a little thing. Well, that's fine. Stop doing it and see what happens. And what'll happen is your vision will clear a little bit. And then something else will pop up in your field of apprehension that you will also know you should stop doing, and that you could stop doing, because you've strengthened yourself a bit by stopping doing the particular stupid thing that you were doing before. That just puts you together a little bit more. And you can do that repeatedly for an indefinite period of time. And you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to ever be able to formulate a clear and final picture of what constitutes the truth and the good. But it does mean that you'll be able to continually move away from what's untruth and what's bad. And, you know, that's not a bad start. Well, you have to treat yourself like you matter. Because if you don't, then you don't take care of yourself, and you become vengeful and cruel. And you take it out on people around you, and you're not a positive force. None of that's good. So you suffer more, and so does everyone around you. And there's a malevolence that enters into it. None of that's good. So that's what happens if you don't treat yourself like you matter. And then, well, what happens if you don't treat other people like they matter? Well, you lie to them, you cheat them, you steal, you enter into impulsive relationships with them. They can't trust you. That doesn't go anywhere. They don't like you. You end up alone at best, and maybe like incarcerated at worst. Like, that doesn't work. And so you watch the people around you who thrive, regardless of what they say. They act out the proposition that everyone matters. And then you have a functional society. And I think, okay, well, if when you act out the proposition that everyone matters, you have a functional society, maybe that's evidence that that proposition is true. It's like, I think it's true. It's unbelievable how little genuine encouragement many people need, and how they had none. No one ever said to them, and meant it, it's not okay for you to be a weak loser. It's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is because you could be way more than that. And it's a crime, an ethical crime, for you to allow all that necessary potential to go to waste. It hurts you, it hurts your family, it hurts the world. Really, really, it does. And people think, oh, okay, I get it. And they do get it, because they know at some level. The other thing people tell me, you know, they say, well, I've been paying attention to your lectures, developing a vision for my life, trying to tell the truth, trying to adopt more responsibility, and things are way better. But the other story is, you've been able to help me put into words things I always knew to be true, but didn't know how to say, which is a good role for an intellectual to play. And so, well, so that's why this all makes me emotional. It's so good, you know, and so much of this has been covered as if it's political. It's not political, what I'm doing. It's not political. I don't tell people that they're okay the way they are. No, I say, no, you could be way more than you are. And they're relieved about that, you see, because if you're in a dark and terrible place and someone says you're okay the way you are, then you don't know what to do about that. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm having a terrible time, and I'm hopeless. You're okay the way you are. Well, then what? That's it? That's where I am? And what do you want to tell a young person? You're 17. You're okay the way you are. It's like, no, you're not. You got 60 years to be better, and you could be way better. You could be incomparably better across multiple dimensions. And in pursuing that better, that's where you'll find the meaning in your life. And that will give you the antidote to the suffering. People have asked me in my book why wrote it as an antidote to chaos, you know, because, well, there isn't anything technically wrong with chaos. Chaos is a place of great potential. Well, the question is, what's the proper balance between chaos and order? Chaos, potential, and order. Well, the answer is, look, when you're a kid, you're all potential. It's chaotic potential. It can manifest itself in any number of ways. And maybe you don't want to give that up. So you're like Peter Pan. You want to be a kid forever because you don't want to give up the potential. And you look out in the world and all you see are Captain Hooks, you know, who've lost a hand, who are chased by death because that's the clock in the crocodile. It's already got a taste of him. He's terrified by death and he's a tyrant. Well, I don't want to grow up to be that. So I won't be disciplined at all. Well, that's no good, because the way the potential transforms itself into actuality is through discipline. And so then you, as you said, this is the trick though. You have to pick a path of discipline. What path of discipline you have to pick is a different issue. So there could be a rule. The rule might not be follow this rule. The rule might be you have to follow some rules. So it's a meta rule. And the meta rule is you have to discipline yourself. And the issue is, well, how? That's not really the relevant question. You can pick a disciplinary path. That's why I often tell my clients, especially young people, they say, well, I don't know what to do. It's like, that's okay. Nobody does. Go do something. Do the best thing that you can think of. Put the best plan you have into practice. It's not going to be perfect, and it will change along the way. But it will change partly because you become disciplined pursuing the path. And as you become disciplined, you become wiser. And as you become wiser, you become able to formulate better and better plans. So you can start vaguely and confused and develop a plan that's not so great, and you start to implement it, and then you accrue incremental wisdom as you implement your flawed plan, and that enables you to fix the plan. And so that's part of that process of incremental self-improvement as well. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's, don't be so sure that your position in your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. The same basic idea, right, is that you have to get your markers for success right, because otherwise you can end up in the situation you described, which is that, like, there's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because you shouldn't just compare. Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. You just don't know any of that. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
So, and you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. It's funny. I mean, you know, obviously, if you have a problem and you think about it, you can think up a solution. And it's not obvious how you do that. You know, I mean, it's not like you know how you're manipulating your neurons or something. Mm-hmm. It happens of its own accord in some sense, like you can participate in it, I guess, and you can interfere with it, and it seems to take a certain amount of willpower, but it still all happens mysteriously behind the scenes. You cite a tired brain, foggy thinking, as the reason to stop answering questions or giving a talk. How do you combat this while working or writing daily? Well, I eat a big breakfast relatively soon on waking. That really helps. If any of you out there are anxious, and many of you no doubt are, there'll be a large number of you who are anxious and don't eat breakfast. There'll be a whole bunch of you out there who think, well, I don't eat breakfast. It isn't necessary. It's like, that's wrong. It's necessary. You fasted all night. If you load yourself cognitively or physiologically in the morning, your brain, stressed, will encourage your body to produce insulin. It will take all the blood sugar out of your blood, and then you're done for the day. And then you'll be anxious. And a lot of the rest of you too, you'll find if you're anxious, try this. It's really, really interesting experiment. The next time you're anxious, go eat something. Eat some protein and fat would be best. You could have cheese and crackers. I'm not a big fan of carbohydrates, but whatever. Eat whatever you're willing to eat, but make it solid. Don't eat a peanut butter, or don't eat a chocolate bar or something sweet. Eat something substantial, a piece of meat, a piece of cheese, some peanut butter, something like that. And then wait 10 minutes and see if you're less anxious. And try that for like 2 weeks. Every time you get anxious, eat something. Because then you can find out if your anxiety is linked to low blood sugar. And it's very likely that it is, especially if you also get irritable and foggy in your thinking. And the best way to treat that, as far as I've been able to tell, and there's a decent literature on this, is to make sure that you eat a big breakfast. And you might say, well, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, who the hell cares if you're hungry? I didn't say enjoy your breakfast. I said eat it. That's not the same thing. There's lots of things that you need to do that you don't enjoy to begin with. You'll get hungry in 6 months and then you'll start to enjoy it. So that's a massive difference. I take small naps quite frequently. If I'm wiped out, I'll go have a nap for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And then that helps quite a lot. I try to wake up on a fairly regular schedule. That's another thing I would really recommend for people whose lives are in disarray and who are anxious. Try to fix your wake time. Going when you sleep, that's not so important. So you can still, stay up late and have fun and all that. But getting up in the morning is really helpful. So, and you also have to figure out how much you can work or write. I can't write for more than about my sustainable maximum for writing is 3 hours a day. And if I push it past that, then, especially if I'm editing, I make mistakes when I'm editing, so that's counterproductive, and I can't sustain it across time. And so I don't really think you can do more than about 3 hours of extremely intense intellectual work a day. Although if you have a nap, you can stretch that, but I think at least I end up paying for it across time. So nap, make sure you eat, and make sure that you get enough sleep. So that's how I combat it and try to make myself hyper efficient. You're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself, and the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. That works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things that are wrong. You'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then The solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can, and then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. You only have to ask a stupid question once. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where you could stop that. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this, like you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. My life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. What's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and The only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum.
Is mental health genetic, habit, or personality? And how can you improve or master it?
Yeah, well, it's all of those things, you know. You might say, well, it's unfair that it's genetic. Well, look, we all have different temperaments, okay? There's 5 dimensions of temperament. Extroversion, that's sensitivity and threshold for positive emotion. Neuroticism, that's sensitivity and threshold for negative emotion. Agreeableness, that's kind of maternal compassion and empathy versus a kind of tough, more individualized, what would you call it?
Decisiveness.
Yeah, good. Conscientiousness, that's dutifulness. Industriousness and orderliness. Openness, that's creativity and interest in ideas. 5 dimensions. Okay. Where you land on those dimensions is determined to a large degree by the genetic lottery. And now there's some movement on each dimension that can occur as a consequence of socialization, but it's bounded by the place you landed when the cards were dealt, by the genetic code when you were born. And you might say, well, that's unfair. It's like, well, it's not unfair exactly. It's just, there's a randomness about it within a bounded world. And it's not unfair partly because every advantage comes with a disadvantage. So if you're extroverted, you're social and you're positive, but you're impulsive. And you can tilt towards hedonism, and you can't stand being alone. If you're high neuroticism, well, you suffer a lot of anxiety and pain, but you're pretty sensitive to threat, and you might see danger before anyone else does, and then you don't die. And so, and maybe your children don't either. And if you're agreeable, well, you're compassionate and caring, but you're going to not stand up for yourself very well, and you're going to, your temptation is going to be bitterness and resentment. If you're conscientious, well, you're orderly and industrious, but you can get obsessive. And if you're creative, well, then you end up with purple hair and nose rings. And I did a study at Harvard in like 1994 when piercing and tattooing started to first emerge on the cultural landscape, because we were trying to find out if it was a marker for psychopathology, which wasn't obvious at that point. Well, because it was a subcultural practice before that. It was circus people and prisoners and so forth that were tattooed and who were pierced. And then it spilled into the mainstream, and we were curious, as I was in the psychopathology and personality sub-department in the Harvard Department of Psychology, and I worked with a colleague of mine, Jill Hooley, and we never published this study. Many studies end up not published, but it was very interesting. The best predictor of tattooing and piercing was just creativity. There's no sign of assorted psychopathology, except the psychopathology associated with creativity. And you might say, well, what's that? And it's like, well, most creative ideas are stupid and wrong. So, you know, why shouldn't you have ideas? Well, because most of your ideas aren't any good. And how do you know that? Well, try starting a business. The probability that you're going to fail is extremely high. Most people who end up with a successful business have failed multiple times because it's very hard to figure out what the market needs this moment. It's really hard, and so you'll flail around trying to hit that target. And if you're creative, you're going to come up with a lot of ideas, but that doesn't mean they're good. And even if they are good, doesn't mean they'll work. And so most people, because most people aren't creative, by the way, they're not even a little bit creative, and that's because creativity is a high-risk, high-return strategy. And If you win, you can win big, but the probability that you lose is pretty damn high. Hardly anybody makes any money from a book. And it's really hard to write a book. And like, how many books have you written? None. And how many successful books have you written? And, you know, like there's a 1 in 100 chance maybe that you've written a book. I doubt if it's that high. Like actually written and published a book. It's probably more like 1 in 1,000. And then 99.9% of books sell less than 200 copies. So you got a 1 in a million chance at best of writing a book that is going to be successful. You know, and you might ask, well, then why bother? And the answer is, well, most people don't. That's how they solve that problem. Just don't do that, and then you won't fail. And most of you probably haven't written a symphony, or even a song, or a play, and you probably don't dance, but some of you do, but I doubt if you've ever generated a truly original dance, except by accident, and then generally people will just laugh about that. So we studied creative achievement across a wide range of people. We had developed a 13-domain scale with 8 levels of competence in each domain. So on the musical front, it would be, you know, I have no training or interest in this area. To, you know, I've written original compositions that have been played internationally by major musicians. And you sum across all 13 domains, and the median score, which is the most typical score, is 0, and 70% of people score 0. And the next most common score is 1. And that's like, now you got 80% of people. Okay, what's my point? No matter where you land in the temperamental landscape, you're going to have your associated faults and temptations. And you're going to have your associated proclivity to your particular form of mental illness. So now that might visit you if you're particularly unlucky, or you might fall into that if you're incautious. But you generally don't get an advantage without an attendant disadvantage. So that's on the genetic front. And then there's environmental variability, for sure. You can take a neurotic child. The studies have already been done on this. So some children by, let's say 2, although you can actually measure this by 6 months. So imagine you have a child in a room, a lab, and his or her mother is there, and the mother is sitting, and the child's here, and then a little wheeled robot is remote controlled in by the experimenter. Well, some kids will just run right over and engage with the robot, and other kids will hide behind their mother and then sort of peek out. And the ones who hide are higher in negative emotion. And then if it's a baby-eating robot, they're not dead. So that's their strategy. Whereas the, you know, hey, your kids are going to go play with a strange dog at the playground, you know, or not. And sometimes that's real fun. And sometimes it's no fun at all. And sometimes it's the, you know, kid who's hiding behind his mother's legs that doesn't have his face torn off by the pit bull. So there's variability for a reason, you know, and then the more neurosis prone, the more kids more prone to negative emotion, they're going to suffer from a higher proclivity for depression and anxiety later in their life, and that's the price they pay for their threat sensitivity. But if you take those kids and you really encourage them to explore voluntarily instead of facilitating their proclivity to hide themselves, you can tilt them up into the normal range for negative emotion. And those studies have already been done. And so you're never going to take a kid who's really high in trait neuroticism and make them as low in trait neuroticism as someone, you know, at the 99.9th percentile genetically. You just can't. And maybe you could do it if you did nothing else than train that child like 12 hours a day for 10 years. But you can shift people a fair bit. And if you're introverted, you can learn extroverted skills. And if you're agreeable, you can learn to stand up for yourself. And if you're unconscientious, you can learn to discipline yourself, although that's a tricky one. Because you usually don't have the discipline to discipline yourself if you're unconscientious. So, and then in terms of habit, well, you become what you practice. And so if you're high in neuroticism, it's going to take a lot of practice to get you all calmed down. But that's what you do in psychotherapy with people all the time, because a large number of people who are in therapy have higher than average levels of negative emotion, and you help them become stronger. And the way you do that is by strategizing with them and encouraging them to confront the things that they're afraid of and avoiding, and they become more able and more courageous as a consequence of doing so. And you can shift people quite a lot doing that, and that's what you do when you learn, and that's how you teach kids, and it's the universal mechanism of adaptation. And you try to speed that up in psychotherapy, and you can do that for yourself. Like this is a really useful what would you call it? Ritual, routine. So look, you've got a goal, and you'll see that as you progress towards the goal, there'll be obstacles that emerge, and some of them you don't want to confront. You're going to shy away from them, So maybe I have a client, and they're being tyrannized at work, and they need to get another job. And to do that, they have to put their CV in order, and they're embarrassed about their CV, and they don't even want to open the file on their computer that contains their CV, which they haven't looked at for 10 years, and which contains nothing but a record of their dismal failures in the past, as far as they're concerned. And that's a box that's locked, that's Pandora's box with a dragon in it, and they don't want to go anywhere near it. And no wonder, But if they're going to get another job, well, unless they get their resume together, they're stuck under the thumb of their local tyrant, and that's not a good deal. And so often what you do with someone like that is you say, just print your resume. Don't even look at the bloody thing. Just print it, turn it upside down, put it in an envelope, and bring it to the session the next week. And then the person will come back and say, that task that we agreed on, because you have to agree on these things, I didn't do it. I couldn't even sit at the computer. And so then you say, well, do you think this week you could just sit at the computer and think about opening your resume? And they might say, yes. And then they come back the next week and said, I didn't even sit at the computer and think about my resume. So then you say, okay, we'll do it right now. Okay, close your eyes. Okay, now, imagine your computer. Bring it to mind as vividly as you can. All right, now, imagine you're walking into your room, and now the goal is to sit at your computer. So now why don't you tell me what happens? So imagine your office. Okay, now you're walking in. Now tell me what happens. You're going to walk towards your computer. Just describe it.
First I sit down.
Okay, and how are you feeling?
Relaxed.
Oh, well, you're not much help in this particular example. No, you mean terrified out of your skull.
Oh, you want me to be terrified?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You didn't say that.
She's not very high in neuroticism, by the way, as you can tell because she's married to me. So, okay. So
I'm terrified.
Okay. So what's happening? Good. So what's happening with your breathing?
Shallow.
Okay. So try to pay attention to your feet for a minute. Okay.
They're twitching.
They're twitching. Yes. Okay. So just try to let them kind of sit heavily on the floor.
Oh, okay.
Now pay attention to your calves. And let them relax, and then you walk the person through their body, and you say, now pay attention to your breathing, just relax. Now you don't have to do this with people, but it's a good thing for them to learn. Okay, now, so how are you feeling? By the way, you're feeling slightly better.
I am feeling slightly better, yeah.
Okay, good. Now, imagine that you just turn on your computer. Okay, so what happens when you just turn on your computer? You get more nervous.
I shallow breathe.
Yeah, okay. So now you get the point, and then you walk the person through turning on their computer and then opening up the dread folder and then reading the title of the horrible dragon resume and then maybe opening it. And then you say, that's good enough for this week. And then maybe the person can go home and just open their damn resume. And then maybe they can print it out and bring it to you. And then maybe you can go through the sub-reptiles one by one, and clean out the snakes. It's like, well, what were you doing between 2011 and 2013? And the answer is, that is the last thing that I want to discuss with anyone, right? So there's a lacuna, there's a hole in the account, in the autobiographical account, and chaos itself is looking through that with all that disorder and shame and malevolence lurking in the background, and no one wants to look at that. You think, well, you didn't do a very good job between 2012 and 2013, and you've got a hole in your record, and we right, and we need to do something about that now. And so, you know, how do we address that so that you have a coherent account of yourself? And look, this could take a good while, right, to put that all back together. That's your whole past, to put that together in a manner that you could confidently bring forward to a new potential employer. But it's worth it if you escape from tyranny and you now have a coherent account of yourself and you've atoned for your past inadequacies, let's say, and you're ready to move forward. And partly what you do in therapy and partly what you should do with yourself is not hide all that in the fog, you know, so you know where you are, and so you can figure out where you're going, and then practice doing that. And then as you practice doing that, then that's what you become, and that will lower your proclivity to negative emotion, definitely, as you put your life together. That's why it's useful to order your room. Chaotic room makes you anxious. Why? Too many pathways, man. You walk into someone's room and you think, what the hell is going on here? Maybe that's your teenager's bedroom. And you've pretty much summed it up in the question. It's like, yeah, it's a little slice of hell in that room, you know? And so, and how do you feel when you're there? Like you'd rather be anywhere else. And no wonder, because everything in the room is broadcasting chaos and disorder at you. And so that's another thing I used to do with my clients, typical behavioral maneuver, which is, if you're anxious, organize your surroundings a bit. You know, simplify, declutter, organize bit by bit. Order, habitable order. The habitable order that is good. All of that. It's a recreation of the original Eden, metaphysically speaking. And you can do that very practically, and then you practice that, and that'll sort you out. You know, assuming you're not physically ill. And even then, sometimes, you know, to the degree you can get yourself, right together,
yeah,
you know, bit by bit, you'll even push physical illness into abeyance, not least because you decrease your stress response, and that's fight or flight, and fight or flight stress responses inhibit your immune system. And so if you're always in the state of chaos, your immune system is suppressed and you're far more likely to become ill. So you put order in place of accidental chaos and everything snaps into place. And there isn't anything better you can do than that. And there's no limit to how much of that you can do. You know, you start locally. Start with the things that are right in front of you. There's plenty of problems that are right within your grasp. You know, they might seem trivial to you, but they're not, because the things you do aren't trivial. And that's just where you have to start. And then, you know, once you got yourself kind of ordered locally, well, then start making your relationships harmonious. And once you're good at that, then you got a whole group of people around you that are behind you, and then you can expand outward from there. And there's no end to that. That's the opportunity and responsibility. And that's the pathway to meaning. And that's the antidote to suffering. So those are all good things to know. And that's a good place to stop. So that's where we'll stop. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Very nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. Because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. Maybe you're, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism. And if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous. And if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, and because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the 3rd mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of a an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown, it's there, it's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you? You know, you're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. And they're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society. I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea. This is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update, because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this has also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women, because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, it doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, you know, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you know, you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that that the solution emerges. And I don't, you know, I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. Is that if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual, because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing. And so all you have to do is give up your resentment and your hatred. I know that's a hard thing to give up because you have plenty of reason for it. That's probably a good place to stop. So it was a pleasure. I had lots of clients and students who were chaotic in their orientation to life. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do about not knowing what to do. It's like, I don't know what to do with my life, and I don't know what to do about my ignorance. And my reaction to that, in some sense, wasn't exactly the reaction of a clinician, because not a typical clinician, because typical clinicians are liberal Protestant in their fundamental orientation, and they tend to think of psychological development as something like self-actualization, right? It's really a self-development process. But that wasn't my observation, partly influenced by the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I had a more communitarian view of human development than that, and my observation was that most people find the cardinal meanings in their life not as a consequence of the development of their self, whatever that is, but in service to other people, in the adoption of responsibility. You know, because you're told, be responsible, and it's a finger-wagging thing again, you know, that if you were a good person, you be responsible, you do your duty. But no one ever says, well, because that's where you find the abiding meaning in your life, and you need that meaning to sustain you through suffering. And that's definitely the case. You know, I was very ill for a number of years, and a lot of what got me through that wasn't my own special nature, let's say, but the support of my family and the support of my friends and the support of the broader community made a huge difference, not only psychologically, because I knew people were supporting me, but also practically. You build yourself a community, you sacrifice yourself in the service of other people, not so much because you should, although you should, but because that is where meaning is to be found, and you need a deep meaning to sustain you through tragedy. That's the arc. And you find that deep meaning, and you know, there's a notion that it's better to give to receive than to receive, and it sounds like a Hallmark greeting card in some sense, and people are cynical about that too. Well, yeah, you say that because you should be good and think that, but if you watch yourself, you'll see that it's true, because one of the things that's been really pronounced element in my life is that, you know, people thank me from time to time for things that I've done or said, and there isn't a better experience than that, you know, that you've put something out that's actually a manifestation of what you truly believe, and the consequence of that is part of the redemptive process for someone else. There is nothing that's better than that. Zero, nothing. In fact, I don't think there's anything that's even in the same conceptual universe of that in terms of its intrinsically rewarding properties. There's nothing better than to have people, perhaps particularly people you've never met, tell you that what you have been doing has had a salutary effect on their lives. And so that's a hell of a fine thing to aim for. And why not aim for it, you know? Because you could do it. If you put, I wouldn't even say necessarily that you put other people first, because I think that's a mistake, but I do think it's the case that you treat other people in the manner that you would wish to be treated if you were treating yourself properly. And that's also a sophisticated thing, right? To learn to treat yourself properly. Because that doesn't mean you get to fulfill every momentary whim, because that's what you do when you're 2, and 2-year-olds can't live without their parents. You know, you have to be wise enough to govern your current behavior in light of the future. And that's really what it means to be an adult. It's what it means to forestall gratification and to attain the responsibility of an adult. And the reason that you should do that, because you should, is because it's actually better, you know, in all ways. It's a panacea for suffering to adopt that responsibility. So I would tell my clients and students as well, it's like, well, let's just take a look at where other people find meaning. you know, and we'll see how your life matches with that. Do you have an intimate relationship? Yes or no? The right answer is yes. Now, maybe not for you, and maybe you don't right now, and maybe you have your reasons not to because you're a singular person in that regard, but probably not. Because that's like a third of life. And so if you don't have that, that might be one of the reasons you're not doing so well. And the fact that you don't have it might be an indication that you're not oriented in the proper direction. Oh, I can give you an example of that. I had many people question me when I was just on tour. This is a question that came up quite rapidly, often in the Q&A sessions. How do I find the right person when I'm dating? How do I find the person who's right for me when I'm dating? And I got that, or on the internet, I got that question like 3 times in a row, and I thought, because I always think this, what about that question? What's wrong with that question? Something wrong with that question. How about, how do I conduct myself so that I am the best possible partner? Now that's a whole different, right? That's a whole different conceptual universe, and virtually no one ever asked that question. And I would say, well, if you want an answer to the first question, which is how do I find the person who's right for me, you actually start by asking the second question, which is what can I bring to the table for someone else? And if you're really good at bringing something to the table for someone else, hey man, people might be lining up to be your partner. And if they're not, then you might think, well, maybe I'm just not bringing the right thing to the table. And that's worth thinking, especially if you're desperate, you're lost, and you're alone. It's like, maybe I got this wrong. And I usually sort of top that with the suggestion that even if you did find the person who was perfect for you, and they're that perfect, what makes you think they wouldn't take one look at you and run screaming away? And they likely would if they were that perfect, because, really, are you that much of a catch? And if you think you are, that might be part of the problem. So that's one, right? Intimate relationship. So I would say to you at the crossroads, develop a vision for your relationship. There's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. It's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's worth thinking about. So, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find, but not without aim. And so I might say, well, look, if you could have the relationship you wanted, you get to have the relationship you want and need. But you have to know what it is. And so then you need a vision of that. It's like, and a developed vision, Not, I need to find the person right for me. It's like, what do you mean by that? How are you going to treat your partner when they come home from work? How about something that concrete? Or how would you like to be treated when you come home from work? Or what sort of partner do you want in relationship to their attitude towards children? You have to make it real, like it's the story of your own life, which, by the way, it is. And then maybe you find it, because at least once you've developed the vision, if it manifests itself, you'll recognize it. That's something. Why don't you set your family right? No, you need siblings. Maybe you don't have them. Set your relationship with your parents right. Fix your relationship with your father, with your mother, with your siblings. The same thing. And then what sort of relationship do you want to have with your children? If you could have what you wanted. I had a very good relationship with my children. My daughter, as I said, was very ill, so that made things complicated. But I had a great relationship, and still do, with my son. It's one of the lights of my life. And we concentrated on making that relationship pristine, both of us, and my wife as well. And so you imagine, well, I want my son to love me. I want my son to respect me, and vice versa. I want a child who can make mature decisions. I want someone I can rely on. I want someone who other people gravitate towards. Because I can have what I want if I'm willing to make the proper sacrifices. And so that's a good thing. Could you set your family straight? Well, you need a job or a career. And so what can you offer, and what can you bring the world in that regard? And then I would say, well, if you're thinking about career success in this Tower of Babel manner, then that's a temptation. But you might think, well, how much good could I do if I had the opportunity in the shortest possible period of time, if I went all in? And then there's an aim, man, there's an aim. And then you might think, well, what would that look like? You know, if I was a light to my community, if I was a light to the people I work with, who would I be if I was like that? And then you can conceptualize that, and you can see when you deviate from it, and why couldn't you correct for the deviations and move towards that? And then you might say, well, are you going to make productive use of your time outside of work? Productive and generous use of your time? Productive, generous, and meaningful use of your time. How about that? You're going to control your susceptibility to temptation, regulate your alcohol and drug use, because alcoholism takes out lots of people. Regulate your sexual temptation. You can control yourself for some reason that's worth controlling yourself for. You know, because there's something to being sybaritic. There's at least the momentary pleasure. It's not nothing. And you're not going to sacrifice that, if you have any sense, unless you sacrifice it to something clearly better. I called the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are. Which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now, you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. You know, one of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people, for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you know, and you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right, so it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right, you have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe we can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal, and then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So, okay, so in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So the one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena, and that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful, and so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because that's the scientific method removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because the collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're going to occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree, but that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much. And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. So if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so, well, there's other constraints on the mechanisms of interpretation that you place in the world. So we could say, well, you're constrained in your interpretations by the constraints that other people place on you. But there's internal constraints as well. We talked about those mostly from a biological perspective, because you could also regard yourself in some sense as a loose internal society. And that's sort of a psychoanalytic dictum, right? You're a collection of sub-personalities, or you could say you're a collection of sub-routines. I don't care how you formulate it, but you're a unity, but you're a unity that brings together a plurality of subcomponents. And part of the constraints on how it is that you lay out your interpretation of the world is that you have to satisfy those internal subsystems, right? So you're the ego, but it's more like you're the captain of a ship full of people who are rowing. You got to keep the people rowing. You're not tyrant. You're not omnipotent tyrant of your own destiny. You're constrained by the nature of your own being. And so you have to provide yourself with food, and you have to provide yourself with shelter, and you have to provide yourself with water, and all of these things. And those are demands that are laid on you by the nature of your internal processes. And of course, how they lay themselves out as demands and what the appropriate solutions to that is, to those problems are, is debatable infinitely. But you can see the constraints stack up. You have to satisfy your internal constraints. So they have to be brought into a unity. That seems to happen, at least in part, between the ages of 2 and something like between the ages of birth and 4 years old, maybe even 2 years old. You bring yourself together into something that's sort of functioning as a unity. Then you have to turn that unity into a unity that can function in the social world with increasing breadth. And that unity in the social world has to be a unity that can function inside the natural world. It's something like that. So you're stacking up these games into a hierarchy of increasing complexity. And one of the questions that emerges from that is, well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? If it's a hierarchical structure, it has to be a hierarchical structure, because some things have to be worth doing more than others, or you can't act, which is another thing I really don't like about the postmodernist ethos, because it claims that value structures are there to eliminate, to exclude and oppress, and never once notices that, well, yeah, fair enough, but value structures are also there so that you know which way to walk, because you can't figure out which way to walk without saying that that direction is preferable to that direction. So you're stuck with the damn things. And they do exclude. Obviously, category structures exclude. The question is, if you're going to have a value structure, how is it that it should be constituted? Well, I already described some of the constraints. Like if your value structure is perfectly functioning except that you don't get enough to eat, that turns out actually to be a fatal problem, right? And it might be, you can run into all sorts of fatal problems. You're too lonesome. Well, it means let's say that your value structure is too narcissistic. There's lots of reasons to be lonesome, but that might be one of them. Or you're too timid or something like that. Like you're going to be informed by your own internal biological mechanisms when the value structure that you're laying out in the world is insufficient to keep itself propagating across time. And some of that's just you, and some of that's other people, and some of that's the natural world. Constraints galore. And so in the face of all those constraints, it's absolutely unreasonable to say any old solution goes. Just try it. Generate a random solution. Run it as a simulation in the world. And see how many slings and arrows come your way. There'll be plenty. And you might say, well, I don't care about slings and arrows. It's like, yeah, no. That's a claim you don't get to make. So, okay, so you're being informed internally as to the nature of your value structure. You have to specify where you are. You have to specify where you're going. You have to integrate all your underlying biological mechanisms into that schema. It's something I think that's actually kind of weak about the Piagetian ideas, hey? Because Piaget, I'm a great fan of Piaget, but Piaget tended to think that the child came into the world with nothing but a set of reflexes. I mean, that's his technical claim, and that you bootstrap off those reflexes, and I think it underestimates the degree to which the child comes into the world as an already prepared unit. And I mean, he just thought of those things as so self-evident that you don't need to talk about them, but that's actually not true. You do need to talk about them. We know, for example, that if you provide children with food and shelter, and adequate food and shelter, but you don't interact with them socially, almost all of them die in the first year, right? It's not optional. Touch is not optional for children. Attention is not optional for children. Play is not optional for children. So it isn't just like, well, the child comes into the world with a set of reflexes and can adapt to any old environment. It's like, no, the environment has to be structured in a certain way or the child will die. And it's very interesting when it comes to things like play and touch, because you wouldn't think of those as fundamental necessities, right? But it turns out that they are. If you deprive a child badly enough of play and touch in the first 3 years of their life, even if they survive, what comes out at the end of that is often something that's like barely recognizable as a functional human being and cannot be repaired after that point. And that experiment was done with Romanian orphans back in the 90s. So it was an ugly situation, to say the least. Okay, so now you take these underlying biological systems and maybe they aggregate themselves into something that vaguely looks like your temperament, your 5 temperamental dimensions. So maybe if you're an extrovert, you're dominated by the dopaminergic system, just like you are if you're high in openness. And if you're high in neuroticism, it's mostly that you're dominated by anxiety systems and systems that mediate emotional pain. And if you're agreeable, you're dominated by the function of the underlying maternal/care affiliation systems. But so you could say, well, you've got a multitude of fundamental biological predispositions that manifest themselves as implicit stories, something like that, and they organize themselves into the primary temperaments, and the primary temperaments are biasing factors that determine in part the nature of the interpretive structure that you're going to lay out in the world. It's not entirely determined by your temperament. We know that personality is only predicting something like, let's say, 10% of the variance in most complex social outcomes. And the other elements are, well, temperamental as you might be, you still have to get along with other people and the world. So you come in with these internal biases, but they still have to be modified extensively by your social and your natural surround. Okay, and then you develop your routines from the bottom up, as Piaget pointed out, and sometimes from the top down, because now and then you can think yourself into a radical transformation. But mostly what you're doing is building the micro units of your interpretive schemas and your behaviors and aggregating them into higher order structures that you can then tag with higher order abstractions. And we talked about that. You can't tell a 3-year-old to clean up his room. And the reason for that is those are empty boxes as far as the kid's concerned. Clean, he might have room, he might have that. Clean he doesn't have. He might have pick up the teddy bear and put it in that space, right? So that's one of these little micro routines. And maybe you say, you put 20 of those micro routines together and now you can say, clean up your room. And basically what you're saying is, implement the 10 micro routines that you've learned. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you're a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they don't know how. You know, sometimes maybe the person's depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dormant. You got to get them awake again and implementing them. But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe, right? The parents never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun. And then, you know, they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And you know, one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is, develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiations. And so you can sort of place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, you know, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where, you know, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like, you're hyper orderly. It's, well, get a dog, you know. Dogs are messy, horrible things, you know. It's just what you need if you're hyper orderly, because they're going to leave hair everywhere and force you to live with it. Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And so, and that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people after all, and even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important, because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1, you know. If you're starting out as a salesperson, for example, the hardest sale is the first customer. And then, you know, they get easier with each additional customer. You got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. If you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. There's nothing you can possibly do to become more deadly than to improve your facility with language. And the way you do that is by reading, especially great things, and by writing, and by thinking, and by speaking, for that matter. But how could that not be viewed as absolutely central to what education is about? You want to be inarticulate and stumble over everything that you try to think and communicate? Yeah. How are you going to get anywhere? You don't even know who you are under those circumstances. You're this massive feeling that's expressing itself, you know, maybe in violence because you can't find the words, and you stumble around and bump into things, and you're clunky and dull, and you're not witty, you don't sparkle. It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month, and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. One of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. And there is something to be said for virtue and truth, you know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life. And you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline. But it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so...
Wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling of the...
many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people, that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people? Or is that ultimately the same thing?
It.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. And it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You need a meaning to sustain you through suffering. And it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well, and so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard-acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in. And he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. And look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying, as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence. If it's well run, and places are full of opportunity. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze me. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you, and you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger. And then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. Accept responsibility for the catastrophe of your life. And that way you transcend it. And there's an unbelievably hopeful message in there. And the message is, you're actually strong enough to do that. You just don't know it. And you won't find out till you do it. You can't find out till you do it. But if you did it, you'd find out that it was true. Bargain with the future. Wow, that's just, what an idea that is, you know, it's so unlikely. It's a massive risk. It's the ultimate in risks, right? You have to be willing to lose your life in order to find it. What you're willing to forego today's pleasure for tomorrow's advantage, and that's what sacrifice is. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. If I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like, there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe a little order there would be a good thing. There's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. So life is brutal, and what you have to set against that is possibility. So I would say if you're 16 and your life isn't so happy, it's like, look around and see if there are opportunities that people are granting you, even imperfect opportunities, because they're going to be imperfect, that you could exploit in the proper way and learn and grow. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is, don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. So imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is. You know? And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information. You take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish around and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. Once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. While you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair, doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. Go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it an aim, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. It's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life. That's an old mythological idea. Chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. You don't choose your interests, they choose you. And that's really worth thinking about too, man, because, it's really hard to get interested in something you're not interested in, even if you know there's a good reason for it. You're studying for an exam, you find the material boring, anything will be more interesting than the study. Even though you know that that's what you need to do, you can't voluntarily grab yourself by the scruff of the neck, let's say, and shake yourself and say, sit down and concentrate. Your mind will just go everywhere. But then if you're interested in something, and even if it's something you shouldn't be interested in, because that happens all the time, then it's like you're a laser focused, man. You can pay attention forever. You can work until you're exhausted. You won't even notice it, and you remember everything. It's like, okay, if you can't control your interest, what does? Your interest was being manipulated behind the scenes by unseen forces that were associated with your characterological development across time. That was the manifestation of the self. So the self is the potential you, let's say. And the way it operates in the present is by gripping your interest and directing it somewhere. And that's part of the instinct of self-realization. It's a mind-boggling idea, really. It's the potential that you are has to manifest itself somehow in the here and now. It has to. And what better way than by directing your attention? It's like, it seems like this might be useful for you. Maybe you get attracted to this person. Maybe you admire this person. That happens with kids a lot. They'll admire someone and then copy them. And you can see that that's obviously part of their developmental progression, right? It's a form of hero worship, but kids are very imitative and they hero worship at the drop of a hat. And so they're entranced by the next stage of development. And if they see someone who embodies that, especially if it's in the zone of proximal development, it's something they could achieve, stretching a bit. They find someone who embodies that next stage of development, and then they start to imitate them and act like them. Well, adults are no different. We're no different. We do it at a perhaps more abstract and sophisticated level. It's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them. And then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like, really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good, that sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know, and I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do, because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic? Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible, and as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough, it's true enough, you're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, you know, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take your, or hyper-conscientious, you'll take yourself apart. Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future, and you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, so something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, well, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? And that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51% not half-heartedly, right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, they're afraid of any number of things, but one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. It's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona, and they'll look around and see if anyone noticed, and sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then they won't do it again. So don't do that. But then now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this, that was actually pretty good, and they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. It's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them, and you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually help your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow. Now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you'll have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down, and then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it. There's so little emphasis in our popular culture, especially with regards to the so-called mainstream media, on discipline and responsibility, that there's a tremendous hunger for anything that pertains to that. And you have a right to be discussing that, I would say, because of your background, which, if nothing else, required a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah, and I ended up writing a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And I'm lucky that I wrote it when I did, because if I would have written it 2 years later, everyone would have said, oh, everyone's talking about discipline now. So yeah, discipline, absolutely. Discipline does bring you freedom in life. And that's something that I kind of figured out over time.
So what do you mean by that? Like, how did you figure that out? And what do you mean by that? Because they're often, and the classic sort of, what would you call it? Romantic rebel is someone who is free from excessive order, let's say. They see freedom and discipline as antithetical, rather than seeing one as a precondition for the other. And so how did you learn that discipline was a precondition for freedom? If I've got the equation, how did that manifest itself in your own life?
So we'll start off by saying this. And look, I was a young kid. I joined the Navy to go in the SEAL teams. I went through SEAL training. I showed up at a SEAL team 1. And when I got there, and as I look back, this is a very powerful thing, even though it's very simple. I'm 19 years old when I show up at SEAL Team 1. I'm done with the basic SEAL training. And I have a goal in my head, which is this. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. That's like, I don't know about anything else. This is what I want to do. I want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. I want to be a good SEAL.
And so as a 19-year-old with all kinds of energy, and we haven't talked about my childhood yet, but I was kind of like a very rebellious kid. When you talked about seeing a kid that looked like you could have handed him a club or a battle axe and he would have probably been feeling a little bit better, I was like that. I was constantly looking around for a club or a battle axe because that's what I felt like I needed to do. And it was beautiful because I was running around the woods as a young kid playing Army. And I just went and actually played Army. That's what I ended up doing. So I never really had to force myself into some mold that I didn't want to be into. So I got to SEAL Team 1, and now I just want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. And so now that starts steering some of my decisions. And for the most part, it steered my decisions in a decent direction. Now, there were some times where, as I look back now, what I thought was a good SEAL was a little bit off, but luckily it wasn't 180 degrees off. It might have been off 30 degrees or 40 degrees. Right. And as I got older and more mature and I figured out more about what that ideal should look like to me, and I could keep chasing that ideal, that was good. But even to be a 19-year-old kid with a 70 or 80 degree corridor to move forward in is not a bad thing.
No, it's a gift.
It's a gift. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So then I'm looking around at other SEALs that were older than me and more senior to me and trying to figure out which one of those guys is a good SEAL.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the guys that were working harder, for the most part, were good SEALs. Now there's just some people that are just way talented.
Right.
And they could show up, 3 minutes before a run or 3 minutes before we do a shooting competition, and they could just walk through it, no problem.
Right.
And that's great for them. It wasn't me. I'm not that great at anything, but I saw other guys that might not be great at anything either, but they worked hard. They showed up to work early. They did the drills that they were supposed to do. They had discipline. And when you have
has amalgamated statistics, and I hope I get this right, but it's approximately correct. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Right. And so, and I think your comments about talent are also dead on. It's like in any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted. And then if they work really hard, they're even more phenomenally gifted, right? Those are the people who break records. But that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. And then I have this new book. I hope you got a copy because did you get a copy? Okay, so I'm bringing it up for a particular reason. I have a chapter in this book called, there's two that are relevant. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's one. And then the course, or what would you call it? A complementary chapter is work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. So you were fortunate, like you had this goal, right? So that meant you had a goal, which is a really big deal because you could learn about goals. You had a sense of a higher mode of moral being, that I would rather be a good SEAL than the person I am now. Well, it's a code of behavior and a way of perceiving. So there's an ethic in that. And then you said as well, your conception of what good SEAL meant changed as you matured, but that's also fine. It wouldn't have changed unless you would have pursued that initial only partially accurate goal. And so that's also a really good thing for people to understand is like, if you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens or it recedes and broadens. And otherwise you'd run out of things to do. So one of the pathways that's on display with regards to the formulation of an identity, let's say, is this injunction, which is really a temptation to love yourself. So we should take that apart. Now, the first question might be, well, what do you mean by yourself? And one answer to that is the person I am now. And you should love and feel good about the person you are now. And that's actually a dubious proposition for a variety of reasons. One is, whatever yourself is not only what you are. Yourself is also what you could become, and what you will and could become. And so to love yourself properly is not only to love what you are, who you are, whatever that means, but to love who you could become. Now, one of the things I've observed is that it's very demoralizing, let's say, for the typical young man. It's true for the typical young woman as well. So we'll say the typical young person who's miserable and maladjusted psychologically and socially, if you just go to them and say, well, you should feel good about yourself, because they think you're good just the way you are. You're perfect just the way you are. You should accept yourself just the way you are. It's like, well, okay, so what does that say about who I should become? Is that just now off the table because I'm already good enough in every way? So am I done or something? What about who I should become? And then, well, how should I feel good about myself when I don't? Because I'm not getting along with myself. I'm anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and depressed, and I'm not getting along with other people. So how is it that that's all somehow something I should feel good about without being deluded? And these are complicated questions, because you don't want to beat yourself with a stick, which might be the opposite of that. So, well, feel bad about yourself. It's like, no, be judicious and merciful with yourself and think that you need to accept yourself in some way, the way a mother accepts a child. But the maternal spirit is not the only spirit that governs the love that a child requires properly. You have the paternal spirit of encouragement as well, which is, well, we need to shelter and protect you and to provide for your security the way you are, but you could be a lot better and should be, and I have faith that you could be, which is the love that I'm delivering to what you're becoming rather than what you are. And so love that you direct towards yourself is partly directed towards that maternal care that's sort of the minimum precondition for basic flourishing, combined with an attitude of encouragement towards the possibilities of your being. And so that's a much more sophisticated so-called self-love, partly because it's the kind of love that envisions you as something that unfolds across time. And it's a much richer conception, because it also implies that there's a responsible adventure to your life. Like you're not all you could be, and there's pain in that, and there's the necessity for a certain amount of judgment about that, and even a certain amount of exclusion, because what you are that is insufficient in some sense should not be allowed to propagate further. But if it's conjoined with encouragement, it's like, yeah, you're in a rough situation there, kiddo, but you know, here's some things about you that are virtuous and good, and they're pretty powerful actually, and if you just made those more manifest, you could dispense with a lot of this immaturity and misery, and you could expand yourself out into life physically and psychologically, and you could start walking this pathway that makes things better. And the thing is that as soon as you start walking the pathway that makes things better, then things immediately become better, because your whole orientation changes. And you know, if you're in a bad place but you're escaping, that's pretty positive, even if it's a bad place. And you might think, well, it's still bad, but it's better. It's like, well, that's a lot better than a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure, because that's hell. Hell is a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure. And so if you take the bad place and it's getting better, well, it's already not hell. That's a start. And so this notion of love, we've confused this with the maternal instinct for an infant. It's like, because an infant under 6 months is like, well, of course, your attitude towards an infant is you're exactly okay the way you are, in the sense that there's nothing to do with an infant under 6 months in the most fundamental sense, except to provide them with total care. But that's not what you do to any child that's older than 6 months. You start laying down some criteria for becoming, for improvement. and some of that improvement, because we could define it, well, there's nothing more perfect than a child, than a baby. It's like, yeah, but that's not true if the baby's 14 years old, right? It's true if the baby's 6 months old and actually a baby, but by 9 months, well, the child is going to start to interact socially. And now there's some principles that the child has to learn to abide by so that social interaction is optimized. And then you want to replace the infant with the toddler who has a certain domain of autonomy and responsibility and a certain capacity for social interaction. And you want to replace the toddler with the young child, with the preschooler, who now can negotiate a shared social space. And you want to replace the preschooler with the older child who's now capable of taking on as much domestic responsibility as is appropriate for that age. You want to take the infant who's entirely dependent and turn them into something that's autonomous and then socially integrated, and then socially integrated in a manner that's moving them towards individual responsibility. And the love is not only love that's devoted to what they are at any point, which is that encompassing maternal love, say, but the love that says, yeah, kid, you know, we're pretty happy you're around, but the new you is going to even be better. And that's encouragement, and that's part of love. It's half of love, that's for sure. And you want to direct that to yourself as well. It's like, you don't want to judge who you are so harshly that you just destroy yourself and everything is cast into the pit. You want to take a look at yourself and say, look, you know, you're a person among persons, and you have intrinsic worth, and you have your flaws, your sins, your domain of ignorance and inadequacy, but that doesn't mean that you're entirely worthless because of that. You have a base level value. That's intrinsic worth, let's say, that's reflective of the fact that you're made in the divine image in the most fundamental sense. You have intrinsic worth, and that's due a certain degree of baseline love. But there's the becoming problem. It's like, well, especially when you're young, most of you is still in the becoming phase. And so why wouldn't encouragement be the hallmark of love? It's like, get the hell up, get your act together, adopt some responsibility, put your life together, develop a vision, expand yourself beyond the narrow confines that are causing your misery. And we think you can do it. You could do it, you should do it, the world would be better off if you did it, you'd be doing better if you did it, everything would work out better. Why would we not work to make everything work out better? And you're the person who could do it. And you tell young people that, and they think, well, no one ever told me that before in that way. And they think, well, maybe I should get my act together. And then they go out and try to get their act together in some micro ways, and they think, well, turned out that worked, and I'm less miserable. I could try doing it a little bit on a broader scale. And they try that, and they think, wow, people seem a lot happier with me. I have more friends, and I'm more popular, and I'm a little more physically attractive because I'm standing up a little bit straighter. And then away they go. And why would you, unless you believe that human being is corrupt and pathological in its essence, which many people now seem to believe, or at least some dread spirit seems to insist, and people agree with it. If you don't buy that, then you think, well, yeah, you unfold, man. Unfold all those manifold possibilities that lurk within and be a force for good in the world, and that'll be the adventure of your life. And I guess we could also add to that a bit of a disquisition on truth. So you should be oriented by love, and you could say, well, that's the desire to care for being and becoming, however it's manifest, to want that to turn out in the best possible manner. That could be your goal. I want things to turn out in the best possible manner. And you have to decide if that's true, because people are tempted to create little hells around them all the time. So don't be thinking that necessarily you want that, because it's not that easy to orient yourself so that that's all you want, because you're bitter and resentful and angry. And so all of that's going to interfere with that vision of love. And then you might say, well, now that you have that vision, what do you have as weapons to clear your path, let's say, or to set things in order as you move forward? And one of the answers to that is, we have truth. Well, why? Well, because you want to contend with the world the way it is, obviously. So truth is going to be useful in that endeavor. And then you might say, well, if I could get away with something by not telling the truth, why shouldn't I just lie? If I could get what I wanted and if I could avoid responsibility, why not lie? And the first answer is, well, what makes you so sure you want to avoid responsibility except narrowly in this moment, because it's not a good medium to long-term strategy and everyone knows it. And what makes you think that manipulating people in the short term so that you can gratify a whim is going to be a useful iterative strategy? It's like it's not. So you can dispense with that. And so what do you do when you tell the truth? Instead, is you predicate your actions on an axiom of faith, which is that nothing better can happen than that which happens if you live in truth. And that's a statement of deep religious faith, because the evidence for that can only be gathered as a consequence of manifesting the actions that are predicated upon that axiom of faith. You don't know till you lay it out. But you can say, well, I believe that the truth will set me free. And then you think, well, the truth will set me free. Who's me? Back to identity. Well, if you're lying, it's not you by definition, because if you're lying, you're attempting to implement a falsehood. You're attempting to falsify the world and yourself. That's what a lie is. And so if something happens that's good because you lied, it's not happening to you. It's a reward for the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you. And if you reward the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you, it will grow. And I would not recommend that. That's a very bad idea. In the contrary situation, you live and speak in truth, and then things happen. They're happening to you. That's your life, man. That's your adventure. And one of the things that's very interesting about the truth in that regard is that it provides a certain optimal unpredictability. You know, if you're talking to somebody, you think, maybe you're being interviewed, or maybe you're having a discussion with someone. You think, I'd like to impress this person. It's like, now you have a little vision of what the instrumental outcome of the conversation could be so that it reflects positively on some narrow conception of a desired future state. I want this person to be impressed with me. So I'm only going to say things they want to hear and that sound impressive. That's all lies. It's like, well, maybe you'll get that result, but it won't be what you want, because it's predicated on a falsehood. Instead, you could just have a conversation with the person, like a real conversation. It's like, what do you think? Here's what I think. Do you like it or not like it? It's like, well, I don't know if you like it or not like it. It's like, we can talk about that and why, but it's still what I think. And that doesn't mean it's right, but it's what I think. Well, then you lay that out, and then what happens to you is what happens to you. And then it's unpredictable, because imagine you're speaking deceitfully and instrumentally. You want something from someone. Okay, well then you're lying, so the you that receives is not you. It's the spirit of deceit. And it's also, you're instrumental because you think that that narrow vision is optimal, even though it requires deceit. You could just throw that away and you can say, well, I'm going to say what I think, carefully and judiciously, feeling out the words, and then I'm going to accept whatever happens, no matter how unpredictable. And then what you'll find is that's where you have adventure. Because you might ask too, well, what do you have to offset against the catastrophe of life? Responsibility, friendship, place, job, career, education, all of that. Adventure. Adventure. Is the adventure worth it? Well, if you tell the truth, you will have the adventure of your life. That's what will happen. Here's some items, so you guys can do a quick big five on yourselves. And I'll tell you the upside and downside of it. So, if you're orderly, you follow a schedule. How many of you follow a schedule? Okay. And how many of you don't? Okay, so one thing I would recommend is that you do. And I'll tell you why. Like, intelligence is a very good predictor of academic performance. And there's not a lot you can do about your intelligence. I mean, you can squander it, but it's very difficult to improve it. Conscientiousness, well, it's a trait too, so it's hard to work on, but we know that conscientious people get better grades. And it's reliable, and it's a powerful effect. And so, if your time use is organized, then the probability that you're going to be successful is very high. So, one of the things you might think about is make friends with a calendar. like Google Calendar or something like that. And I can tell you some tricks about that, because really it is important. Like, and I'm not kidding around about this. If you're low in conscientiousness, it's really going to trip you up as you walk through life. There's not very many advantages to it that I've been able to see, and I'm not assuming that just because you don't follow a schedule you're low in conscientiousness, but it is one of the items that mark it. The only advantage I've seen so far to being unconscientious is that if you become unemployed, it doesn't bother you as much. And I mean, that actually turns out to matter in some situations. So like, you know, if a big company has to shed 50% of its employees, it's the conscientious people are going to suffer themselves to death for it. And the unconscientious people, they're not going to care anyways, because they weren't working anyways. So it doesn't matter if they have a job or not. So here's one way of thinking about making use of a schedule. Often people are afraid of schedules because they think of them as a trap. You know, you make a schedule and it's like this little prison that you have to live inside, and you know, and all you're doing in your schedule is putting down things you have to do or should do, and so, you know, there's not a lot of fun in that. And so not only is it a trap or a prison, but it's kind of an unpleasant one. But a way to work with a schedule in a lot more sophisticated way is to think, well, I'm going to plan the next week, say, because you plan it day by day, but we'll take the week as the unit level of analysis and think, well, I'd like to plan a week I'd like to have. And then your schedule all of a sudden becomes a tool for increasing the quality of your life. And that's a whole different issue, you know, because you might think, what's the emotion that you suffer, assuming you suffer one of these emotions, if you have an essay that's due and you're not doing it? Like, would you regard that as a pleasant emotion or unpleasant emotion? Okay, so do you think you can characterize the unpleasantness? Like, what kind of emotion is it? It's guilt, okay. Anything else? Frustration? Yeah, so you're sort of frustrated with yourself. Yeah, you need a slap, right? You think, I need a slap. And so, okay, so guilt, anything else? Anxiety? Restlessness? So that's kind of an agitation. Yeah, it's because your body knows you should be doing something, but it, you know, you're not pointing it in the right direction, so it's shame? Is that reasonable? So, okay, so the reason I was asking you about that is because, you know, most of the negative emotions are associated with neuroticism, but some of them seem to be associated with conscientiousness. And the conscientious negative emotions seem to be guilt and shame, fundamentally. And so recent research, and really recent, I only got this paper like a week ago, I think it's about 4 months old, seem to indicate that conscientious people feel less guilt, but they're more guilt prone. So if they don't do something, that makes them guilty, but they organize their time so they are doing the things they're supposed to do, so then they don't feel guilty. So anyways, back to the schedule. So, all right, you think about your week and you think about your day, and you think, well, how would you improve the quality of a given day or a given week? Well, one of the ways of improving it is to not put yourself into the situation where there are things hanging over your head that you have to feel guilty and ashamed about, because that's a very unpleasant way of being. And you know, if you have an essay that's due in a week and you're procrastinating, then the fact that you have to do that essay can ruin the whole week. And even when you're doing something that's positive, hypothetically, it's kind of that horrible kind of positive that you experience when you know that you should be doing something else. And so that's when you end up watching YouTube videos about like dancing cats or something like that. You know, and it's at best it's a guilty pleasure. It's not a pleasure at all. You think like, what the hell am I doing watching videos of dancing cats, you know? But then you know that you're procrastinating, and that's low quality, very low quality existence. So if you use your schedule, you can think, okay, well, here's some times that I'm going to do this work. And then you can also sort of ask yourself about that when you're designing your schedule. Because you don't want to design a schedule like you're Adolf Hitler telling yourself what to do, you know, because you're not going to comply with it then. What you have to do if you're going to design a schedule is you have to ask yourself, all right, I'm going to set aside some time to study over the next week or to do this essay or whatever it is. How much time would I actually spend studying? An hour or two a day might be a worthwhile thing to schedule in, and I would say don't schedule in more than that to begin with, because then you'll fail and then you'll stop using the schedule. And so the other thing you want to do is you want to schedule in things that you want to do, and then you want to look at the day or the week and you want to think, hey, that's a week I'd like to have. If I had a week like that, it would be good. You know, I'd be caught up, so so that all that negative emotion doesn't have to accrue. And I would have done a bunch of things that I'm interested in doing, and at the end of the week I'd be in better shape than I was at the beginning. And if you treat a schedule like that, so that what you're using it is to design the days and weeks that you want to have, instead of using it as this little, jail that you have to put yourself in that you're not going to do anyways, then you can learn to use them. And that's one thing you can do to make yourself more industrious, more conscientious. Follow a schedule. I've told people to learn to use a schedule, and people often hate schedules because they act as their own tyrants, right? They say, well, you have to do this unpleasant thing, and then here's another unpleasant thing you have to do, and then you have to do this unpleasant thing, and you do that for about 3 days, and you think, to hell with this, I'm not doing that, and you fall off the wagon. That isn't what you're supposed to do with a schedule. You're supposed to use it to design the days that you would like to have if you were taking care of yourself. And so some of that is, you wake up in the morning and you think, here's 5 things I have to do that if I don't do, my life will be worse. It's like paying bills, for example, or taking out the garbage. It's like you have to do those because otherwise things degenerate. So you got to put some of those in the schedule, because otherwise tomorrow is worse than today, and that's a bad trajectory. But you also want to build in things, you've got to act in some sense like you're dealing with a relatively recalcitrant 9-year-old. It's like, well, here's some things you have to do, but here's some things that if you do, you could reward yourself with. And if you get the balance there between obligation and reward right, then you'll find that you're motivated to do the things. And that's what you want to do. You want to do that so it's sustainable across days and weeks and months. And so you got to treat yourself like a good boss would treat a valued employee, and not like a tyrant would treat a slave, because the slave will rebel. And people say, well, I don't follow through on my plans. It's like, well, they're probably not very well formulated, and maybe you're doing them because of an external moral obligation or something. They're not really your plans, right? And B, you're acting like a tyrant and a slave, and that's a bad relationship to have with yourself. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. It works both ways. You also treat yourself like you treat other people properly. So that's a necessary thing, and often people don't do that. But the scheduling is really important. The hallmark of true sovereignty is the willingness of the elite, let's say the talented, the productive, the blessed, the gifted, to justify the unequal division of talent by serving to ameliorate the catastrophic suffering of the dispossessed. Now, Nietzsche warned about that, right? He thought that Christianity would devolve in some sense into the woke nightmare that it has devolved into. But I think he failed to give the devil his entire due. And the notion that the highest is the highest because it voluntarily serves the lowest, that's a deadly idea. And I don't think it's an ideological idea at all. I think it's an idea that removes the paradox of human existence. And so there's that, but then there's another insistence in both Judaism and Christianity, and I'm not saying it's limited to those doctrines, by the way, that the way to deal with suffering is not to avoid it or to circumvent it with a shallow hedonism, but to face it intensely, head-on, and voluntarily in its full manifestation. And so one of the things I've realized about the Passion story, which Jung regarded as an archetypal tragedy, and in some sense a limit case, right? A story so tragic that you cannot write a more tragic story. Right. Is that it drags the observer, and so that's all of us in Christendom, through the entire catastrophe of human existence, right? So it confronts you with the mob that's after you, that you are also part of. It confronts you with moral relativism in the shape of Pontius Pilate. It confronts you with the oppression of the totalitarian state of foreigners, let's say, in the guise of Rome. It confronts you with the betrayal of your best friend. It confronts you with the willingness of the crowd to punish the virtuous and free the criminal. And that's the story of Barabbas and Christ. And Pajot told me the other day, Jonathan Pajot, that an alternative name for Barabbas was Jesus. And that what the crowd did was pick the political revolutionary over the spiritual leader. And that's perfect. And then it confronts you with the reality that we all face our own mortality, and too early. And the fact that sometimes the innocent and virtuous are punished. And so and then of course there's the horrible, tragic, torturous death, all of that. And that's all signified by the image of the crucifix and what we're doing to ourselves, even though we don't know it. I'm speaking mostly psychologically, although somewhat theologically, is that we're exposing ourselves to the ultimate catastrophe of human existence, while simultaneously manifesting the faith that if we face that unflinchingly, that will resurrect us instead of killing us.
That's quite powerful.
It's something, man. It's something. It's something I've been puzzling out for, well, a long time, but particularly for the last 6 months. I'm going to write about that in my new book. And when I talk to my audiences about that, and I would especially say this has an impact, again, on demoralized young men, and say, look, we don't know the limits to the expansion of your personality if you're willing to face things without deception. And that's a variant of that radical honesty we were already talking about. Don't live by lies. Well, life is rife with injustice, atrocity, and suffering. And so what do you do with that? Do you avoid it? There's good physiological evidence, by the way, that if you take two groups of people and you subject one group to a stressor involuntarily, and you get the other group to take on the stressor voluntarily, that the pattern of psychophysiological response is entirely different. It's entirely different emotionally, motivationally, and in terms of the damage it does. And so the involuntary imposition of a threat is stressful and damaging, but the voluntary acceptance of a threat is invigorating and revivifying. Now, it would be nice if we could be optimistic, and I think, again, the problem with being optimistic is that it's naive. So then the question is there an optimism that's not naive? And I think there is. And the optimism that's not naive is in just a visualization of how strong people can be. So one of the things that I tell people, I've told my students in my class in Maps of Meaning, here's a goal. You want to be the person at the funeral of your father that everyone can rely on. How would that be? You want to be the person who's broken and useless and adding to the misery in the corner. And look, I'm not making light of people's grief. I understand grief. But who do you want to be when there's a crisis? Right? Do you want to be the person that everyone can turn to for strength? It's like, why the hell not? Why not that as a goal? That'd be a good goal, because then if there's a crisis, and there will be, it won't be such a bloody crisis, because there'll be someone there that can deal with it. So when I went and talked to these people at the funeral home, I envisioned that. I thought, okay, well, this is something you have to contend with if you're going to be alive and adult. You have to contend with death and suffering, and you have to be ready for it. And you have to be there for the person, because that's all they're going to have. And so there's a goal, man. And in this time of nihilism, it's what's the point of life? People ask, and they're taught that at universities. What's the point of life? Everything's interpretation. Humanity's a cancer on the planet. Well, how about no? How about not that? How about that there's something to us?